please help me welcome Zach Beck.
Good evening. I'd like everyone to think long and hard about the first time that they ever heard this word, sex, or what it meant. For most of us, it was probably sometime in middle school or high school, probably high school, when you were talking about it with your friends or with your, God forbid, your parents, or maybe you even learned about it from a teacher. But in reality, most of you probably didn't learn about it from a teacher. The sad fact is, in America, sex is a tabooed subject. Most of us don't like to talk about it, or we don't want to explain it to young adults because we think that it's something that only grown-ups do. Well, that's an idea that I believe we need to stop in America. We have to teach our young adults about what sex is and how to have safe sex. And to do that, I believe that we need to implement a comprehensive sex education program in American schools. To define what comprehensive means in this term, in this speech, I would like to say that it's pretty much anything except abstinence-only education. And I'll explain what the difference between the two is in a minute. But essentially, for our purposes, a comprehensive sex education would be teaching young adults about how to properly engage in safe sex, the risks of performing unprotected and unsafe sex, as well as other options for, for women, especially birth control or Plan B pills that are available, and how women can access those options in a free and open environment. So to persuade you that a comprehensive sex education program is needed in the United States, I'd like to talk about three things. First, creating the mandate that a comprehensive sex education program is required. Second, that combining a comprehensive sex education program with already in place HIV/AIDS educations in schools will raise young adults' awareness to how to practice sex safely. And finally, that the government should possibly be responsible for creating a curriculum that is the same throughout every school in America, so every young adult receives the exact same education. And I propose that this be handed to the Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS, in coordination with the Department of Education. So first, I'd like to talk about creating a mandate. We need to talk to our young adults about how to perform sex safely. Most schools practice what is known as abstinence-only education, where teachers who are responsible for teaching our young adults about sex just say, don't do it, because that's the safest. When we face reality, most of us aren't just not going to do it for our entire lives. We need to face up to the fact that almost everybody in the world is going to have sex at one point or another. It's a reproductive process, and we kind of need to do it. We need to teach our young adults how to perform sex safely. According to Advocates for Youth in 2008, 850,000 young adults became pregnant through an unsafe sex because they weren't aware of the risks and dangers involved with unsafe sex. Furthermore, 9.1 million young adults were exposed to STDs because they weren't aware of how to engage in sex safely. This comes from the CDC's, this comes from Advocates for Youth from their 2008 report. The way we can eliminate this problem in the United States is to educate our young adults. We need to implement a program in all of our high schools that teaches them exactly what the risks are and how to engage in sex safely, so that way they can be better prepared for when the time comes for them. Furthermore, abstinence-only education is ineffective. The Journal of Adolescent Health in 2006 stated that abstinence-only programs threaten a young adult's fundamental right to an education where they are fully aware of the dangers of engaging in sex unsafely. Taking away somebody's human right because of a religious belief or a political belief isn't fair to individuals who may or may not think that way. Regardless of what your political or religious affiliations are, it is our duty to teach young adults exactly how they can be safe when engaging in sex. Many schools already offer HIV/AIDS educations, which, when coupled with comprehensive sex education, will increase young adults' awareness to the risks. This is a question for everybody, so I'd like people to participate. 2 young people contract HIV every A minute, B hour, C day, or D week. How many people think A? A couple. B, C, and D. The answer is B. According to the CDC in their annual report, 2 young people contract HIV every hour. Furthermore, the CDC states that this is most likely due to a lack of education of how young adults can avoid contracting the deadly disease. This just makes the case that when coupling a comprehensive sex education program for our young adults, they can avoid risks such as contracting HIV and AIDS, not only extending their lifespan, but also teaching them how to engage in sex safely. Teaching students about HIV is good, but we can do better. J.M. Irving, in her 2004 book, Talk About Sex, states that comprehensive sex education coupled with an HIV/AIDS program already in place in most American high schools will help reduce the number of young adults exposed to the deadly disease. Reducing the amount of AIDS-infected individuals in the United States is definitely something we should strive for. While AIDS is not a problem in the United States as it may be for African countries or in other low-income places around the world, we still have to recognize that this is a disease that many people suffer from, and it is a disease that can be avoided by practicing sex safely with any partner. Being aware of what your partner's sexual history has been, as well as whether or not they may be exposed to any disease, not only HIV or other STDs, is important when discussing whether or not you want to have sex with somebody. Educating young adults about these discussions that they need to have with potential partners is important because it will reduce the risk to contract these deadly diseases. So how can we have a comprehensive sex education and HIV/AIDS program in our American high schools? I propose that the Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS, be tasked with creating a curriculum that is the same for every American high school. The National Conference of State Legislatures over the summer said that an HHS-created program means that the same sex education will be taught everywhere. It seems pretty basic, but when it's coming from the Association of State Legislatures, you know that means business. When the HHS comes up with a program that everybody follows in every school, we can be sure that every American adult, young adult, is receiving the same education. And that means that every young adult is aware of the risks of unprotected sex and how to engage in safe sex. Furthermore, Bleakley, Hennerly, and Fishbein, in their 2006 report in the Archives of Pediatric and Adolescent Medicine, advocate for this with input from relevant agencies. Now, we know that the government is sometimes ineffective, or always ineffective, depending on your viewpoint, but having a government-created program in this sense will make sure that everybody receives the same education and that it is fair for everybody, because it is our human right to know exactly how to engage in safe sex, as well as our human right to knowledge about health. In conclusion, I've talked about creating a mandate, how comprehensive sex education coupled with HIV/AIDS programs will help reduce the amount of STDs and AIDS cases in young adults, as well as an HHS-created curriculum will help our young adults understand how to engage in sex safely. It's a subject we can't avoid because it's inevitable for most young adults. We have to prepare them because it's not only their right, it's our duty. Thank you.
I was wondering if you had a sex education class when you were in high school and what you envisioned these classes looking like, and at the level that the entire market period, I guess, in high school.
When I was in high school, in 10th grade, we had to take a health class, and it wasn't just about sex health, it was about health overall. And my teacher waited until the very last day to discuss this, and it was, of course, an abstinence-only education, so the entire class period was spent telling us not to engage in sex, that the only way to ensure that you'll be safe from contracting an STD or AIDS was to just not do it. And to answer the second part of your question, I believe that, as I kind of stated in the beginning of my speech, that students should be educated right up front about what the dangers are about having unsafe sex, how a young adult or adult later in life can practice safe sex, and how to discuss with a potential partner what the risks are involved and how to have that conversation openly, as well as informing women about the options available to them, so that way they can be prepared for when that time comes as well.
How would you account for cultural differences in student populations, people who came from families that wanted to teach their children about sex on their own terms at the age that they thought appropriate, or that they, from a community that perceived sex as a way?
Well, it's my personal belief that everyone should be educated on sex, no matter what their cultural belief is, but I do understand that there is that difference. So what I think would be the most appropriate would be almost like what schools do now. I remember when I had the health class, parents had to sign a waiver to make sure it was like okay for us to talk about that thing. So I think that if parents are uncomfortable about teaching their children in schools about comprehensive safe sex education, or if they wanted to teach their children at home in their own way, then they could certainly sign a waiver or let the school know, and that way their child wouldn't have to participate in that part of the discussion. Even though I think they should, but to each his own.
Any other questions from the audience? So my question for you is, do you think that schools should be providing contraceptives?
Yes, I do.
What do you think?
Federally funded?
Yes. I'm looking, so.
You're not getting elected anywhere.
All right, thank you so much, Zach.
Thank you.
And for our final speaker this evening is David Lincoln. The title of David's speech is Repeal the Washington, D.C. Building Heights Act of 1910. Please help me welcome David Lincoln.
Ladies and gentlemen, there's something different about our city. I'm not talking about the White House or the National Mall. I'm talking about the heights of our buildings. You may have noticed that we live in a slightly more squat city than many of the other metropolises on the eastern seaboard. This is because of the Building Heights Act of 1910. Now, many people actually think that this law was passed for security reasons, given the nature of our city, but that's actually a common misconception. There are actually many laws similar to this one passed across the United States at the same time as the Building Heights Act. And it was simply because cities did not think that their firefighting teams could handle the stress of a large building. This is no longer a problem. And ladies and gentlemen, I am here today to tell you that we need to repeal this act. My name is David Lincoln. Like all of you, I'm a resident of this city. I'm invested in this problem, and that is why I think it needs to change. Repealing the Building Heights Act and lifting the restrictions on our building heights would allow for more residential living areas in DC, more retail space, and more tax revenue for the District of Columbia. Now, why is this a problem? According to Forbes magazine, living in DC on average is 22% higher than the national cost of living in America. Now, I don't know about you, but that 22% is a pretty tough bullet to bite for me. So what else is the problem? Why would lifting this restriction help the city? According to the DC Office of Planning, raising the limits in DC would allow for more tax revenue to the city. That's because lifting the limits would allow more people to live in the city affordably and it'd create a larger tax base. And all of this would be done without raising individual taxes on DC residents, which are already very high. So this is important to all residents because we're all living in this city, and many of you, many students, might wish to continue to live here after you graduate, as a graduate student or to start a career. And for those people, you could expect to pay $1,800 a month on average for just a single bedroom apartment. And like that 22%, that's pretty hard to afford, especially in a starting career position or as a graduate student. In fact, according to a recent Hatchet article written by a GWU law school student, it's becoming very common for the high rent prices of downtown DC to push GW grad students out of the city and into surrounding Maryland and Virginia homes. Now, I came to this school in part because I love DC. It's an amazing city that affords many amazing opportunities to its residents. And it would be ridiculous to me to attend this school without actually living in the city. So what can we do to change this law? The current law limits building height for most buildings, disregarding a few, to 130 feet. To change this law, we would need an act of Congress. In fact, that's part of the reason why this law is still in place. Many of those other cities that had similar laws were taken away mostly because the local governments are somewhat more efficient than the National Congress, as many of you know. So why should Congress repeal this act? According to an economic feasibility study that was drafted by the Office of Planning, raising the height limits by just a small amount could provide $62 to $115 million in extra tax revenue for the district. As I said, this is because higher buildings means more living space, and that means lower rent, which means more people living in the city. This could also provide for more retail space. For example, if GW were to build just 1 or 2 extra floors on top of, say, Potomac or Thurston, it would be possible for them to convert the ground floor into a dining hall for all GW students, which personally I would really love, because who doesn't hate J Street? So what would happen, say, if this law were repealed tomorrow? We couldn't expect to see immediate change. You don't immediately see new buildings sprouting up in a city. But what we would see would be new residence areas, maybe growing as soon as some of us are beginning to live off campus. And we all know that GW housing is not very affordable. And we could expect rent prices to drop with an increase in affordable housing around the city and in surrounding areas outside of Foggy Bottom. Now, some people might be worried that this could affect how the city feels. I know that one thing that I really love about DC is the open air environment that you get while at the same time living in a large city. This could be a problem, but as you can see in these visual aids, proposed changes to the DC skyline would not cause a drastic change. We're not talking about tearing down the historic buildings in DC and replacing them with huge New York-style skyscrapers. We're mostly talking about adding on to current buildings, maybe 20 to 50 feet, which would allow for just a few more floors of residential or retail space, but would cause great improvement to the city and the quality of life. So as you can see, the current height is this. At 130 feet, which is the maximum at the moment, this is what you would see if every building in the city were at this height. And then as you increase to 160 feet, 180 feet, and even 200 feet, you see very little difference. You can still see the White House, you can still see the National Monument. This is still our city, but there are more people living there. This is a city for more people. So, in conclusion, the Building Heights Act of 1910 is a law that should have been left decades ago. It's up to us to change it, and to change it you need to talk to your representatives because we need an act of Congress. So get on the phone, get online, write an email, write a letter, tell them that you want to see change. And together, we can make this city a better place for more people. Thank you.
All right, David, come back.
Sorry.
You get to answer some questions.
Sorry, I
David,
wasn't running away.
all right, Penny first. Any questions? Start off.
The picture that you showed had the buildings growing behind, but we were looking at the monuments from the water side. How would it make it feel if you were in the middle of the street?
There were actually, the source that I used for this actually had quite a few visual aids that I didn't include just for the sake of time that had it from different perspectives. And what you see is that, like I said, the buildings that are actually surrounding the waterfront are a little bit shorter than the majority of the buildings that are in downtown DC. The ones that are, around here in Foggy Bottom are mostly up to the max. So what you would see would be a fairly small increase, like I said, 20 to 50 feet, which wouldn't really result in a drastic change in how things look. Anybody else?
So my question, oh, go ahead. Is there someone? You got a question? Oh, go ahead, sorry.
After this law was passed, it wouldn't just be people adding additional floors, right? People would start to tear down the buildings and put in new ones so that they could be raised as high as they felt like.
It's possible. The majority, or the place where you would really see that would be in undeveloped areas of the city. For instance, in Foggy Bottom, you wouldn't hear people, tearing down many of the historic buildings just to make new skyscrapers, especially for the fact that just the economic feasibility of tearing down a building and building a completely new one doesn't really make sense when you can just add a few more floors. There was actually the Office of Planning, part of their feasibility draft included a study of sort of what the maximum efficiency you could get from a height was, and they saw that going above 200 feet, you would start to see more cost than gains for most buildings.
Questions from the audience?
Do you think that if the demand increased, if you added these floors, but also the supply increased, do you think that would offset the cost anymore if both of them went up? Because if more people wanted to move to DC still, even though they had more apartments, is that going to change the cost at all? Or that just kind of hits equilibrium?
I think that it reaches a point of equilibrium. Like I said, once you, it can get very expensive, obviously, building new buildings. So you see the most major benefits for those small 20 to 50 several story increases, and also you see more in terms of just the benefit to the city. You see it more. There's some discussion about in terms of how our highways are already overcrowded, so more people living in the city would ruin that, although I would contend that and say if you have more people living in the city, you have less people driving on the highways. But I think that you would reach a point of equilibrium.
Any other questions? Thank you